The air in Lomé was thick with disbelief. Whispers started before sunrise. Faure Gnassingbé, arrested. The words hung, improbable. Yet they spread. From market stalls to grand villas. The city held its breath. Few dared to believe it fully. Radio silence from official channels, no presidential motorcades. Instead, a nervous energy began to build. People emerged from their homes slowly, eyes darting, searching for confirmation. The news, unconfirmed, felt like a dream. Soldiers were on some streets, but their posture was different, less menacing, more watchful. The balance of fear had tilted overnight. The unthinkable had happened. The city was a tinderbox of emotion. The story of Togo was the story of one family, the Gnassingbé family. It began in 1967, a coup d'état. Gnassingbé Eyadema seized power. He ruled with an iron fist for 38 years. His control, absolute. Opposition was not tolerated. Fear became a constant companion. When Eyadema died in 2005, the army installed his son, Faure Gnassingbé. Protests erupted, but the dynasty held. Faure promised reforms, spoke of democracy. Yet the grip remained tight. Elections were often disputed. The results always seemed to favor the incumbent. The opposition cried foul. The people yearned for change. But the machinery of the state protected the family. 58 years under one name. The silence of the people had never been absolute. There were always murmurs. These murmurs were the whispers of discontent, the quiet conversations held in hushed tones in homes, markets, and on street corners. They were the voices of a people who had endured decades of political repression and economic hardship, yet still held on to hope for a better future. Sometimes the murmurs grew into shouts. These shouts were the collective cries of a nation demanding change, the voices of the young and old alike, united in their call for justice and democracy. They were the sounds of a people who had reached their breaking point, no longer willing to be silenced. The years 2017 and 2018 were such a time. During these years, the streets of Togo were filled with the energy and determination of its people. The protests were not just a momentary outburst, but a culmination of years of frustration and a deep-seated desire for change. Massive protests swept across Togo. From the capital city of Lomé to the smaller towns and villages, the call for change echoed throughout the nation. The sheer number of people who took to the streets was a testament to the widespread desire for a new direction. Hundreds of thousands took to the streets. They marched with a sense of purpose, their voices rising in unison as they demanded their rights. The sight of such large crowds was both inspiring and a stark reminder of the power of collective action. They demanded an end to the Gnassingbé dynasty. For over 5 decades, the Gnassingbé family had held power, and the people of Togo had had enough. They wanted an end to the autocratic rule and the beginning of a new era of democracy and accountability. They called for term limits. The protesters knew that without term limits, the cycle of power would continue unbroken. They wanted to ensure that no leader could hold on to power indefinitely, and that future generations would have the opportunity to choose their own leaders. They yearned for true democracy. The people of Togo wanted a government that represented their interests, one that was accountable to them and respected their rights. They dreamed of a future where their voices would be heard and their votes would count. The government's response was harsh. Instead of listening to the demands of the people, the authorities chose to suppress the protests with force. The presence of riot police and security forces in full gear was a clear indication of the government's intent to maintain control at any cost. Security forces met protesters with force. The clashes that ensued were violent and chaotic, with both sides suffering casualties. The government's heavy-handed approach only served to fuel the anger and resolve of the protesters. Tear gas choked the air. The streets were filled with the acrid smell of tear gas, as canisters were fired into the crowds. Protesters scrambled to find cover, their eyes burning and their lungs struggling for breath. Bullets flew, people died, many were arrested. The violence escalated, with live ammunition being used against the protesters. The toll was heavy, with lives lost and many more injured or detained. The government's crackdown was brutal and unrelenting. The crackdown aimed to break the spirit of resistance. The authorities hoped that by using such extreme measures, they could quell the protests and silence the voices of dissent. But the spirit of the Togolese people was not so easily broken, yet the desire for change did not die. Even in the face of such adversity, the people of Togo remained steadfast in their resolve. Small groups continued to gather, their determination undiminished. It smoldered beneath the surface, waiting for a spark. The desire for change was like a fire that had been temporarily subdued, but not extinguished. It continued to burn quietly, waiting for the right moment to reignite. The memory of those protests remained vivid. The images of the protests, the stories of bravery and sacrifice, and the collective memory of the struggle for democracy were etched into the hearts and minds of the Togolese people. They served as a reminder of what had been fought for and what was still to be achieved. The political atmosphere grew even more tense. The air was thick with uncertainty and fear, as citizens gathered in public spaces glued to the news, trying to make sense of the rapid changes unfolding before their eyes. In April 2024, a new constitution was pushed through with unprecedented speed. The legislative process, usually slow and deliberate, was expedited, leaving little room for public debate or opposition. Presidential terms were extended, from 5 years to 6. This seemingly small change had profound implications, altering the political landscape and extending the reach of those in power. A limit of 1 term was introduced. However, this new rule came with a significant caveat. But past terms were not counted. This loophole allowed current leaders to reset their political clocks, effectively granting them additional time in office. Faure Gnassingbé, the sitting president, could potentially remain in power until 2031. This move was seen by many as a blatant attempt to consolidate power and stifle democratic processes. The president would no longer be elected by the people. This fundamental shift in the electoral process was a direct affront to the principles of democracy. Instead, members of parliament would choose. This change effectively placed the power to elect the president in the hands of a select few, further eroding public trust in the government. The public reaction was swift: outrage, disbelief, a sense of betrayal. Citizens took to the streets in protest, their voices echoing through the city as they demanded justice and transparency. Opposition politicians who campaigned against these changes faced severe consequences. The government's response was swift and brutal. 9 were arrested in April 2024, detained for speaking out. These arrests sent a chilling message to anyone who dared to oppose the new regime. The state's intolerance was on full display. The heavy police presence, the barriers, and the barbed wire all served as stark reminders of the lengths to which the government would go to maintain control. The new constitution was law, or so they intended. The government's actions were met with widespread condemnation, both domestically and internationally. The constitution became a symbol of the regime's arrogance. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the constant vigilance required to protect it. The constitutional changes did not go unchallenged. The people's anger spilled onto the streets. Around September 2024, demonstrations erupted. Protesters demanded the restoration of term limits. They called for electoral reforms, a fair system, and independent judiciary. Their demands were fundamental for a just and democratic society. The response was brutal. At least 80 opposition protesters were arrested. The internet was shut down. Communication became difficult. Isolation was a weapon. In Lomé's B district, police fired tear gas. Protesters burned tires, barricades went up, the streets became battlegrounds. Defiance met repression head-on, the air filled with smoke and anger. The final days leading to June 2, 2025 were fraught with tension and uncertainty. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire nation was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. A culmination of all that had passed over the previous months and years. The streets, once bustling with life, now lay eerily silent, a stark contrast to the vibrant protests that had filled them not so long ago. The sentencing of protesters in February had been a turning point. It was a harsh reminder of the state's power and its willingness to use it. The images of activists being dragged away by police were seared into the collective memory of the nation. It sent a chill through activist circles, a stark warning to those who dared to speak out. The fear was palpable, but so was the resolve. For every activist silenced, another seemed to rise in their place, driven by a sense of duty and justice. But it also stoked the embers of defiance. The government's heavy-handed tactics only served to fuel the fire of resistance. The rallies grew larger, the chants louder, and the demands more insistent. The constitutional changes of 2024 remained a deep wound. Small, sporadic protests continued. Despite the risks, people took to the streets, their voices echoing through the corridors of power. They knew the dangers, but the cause was too important to abandon. Despite the heavy hand of the state, the spirit of resistance was unbroken. Then came the news. Unverified at first, it spread like wildfire through the city. Whispers of a significant military movement. Not against the people, but within the ranks. Rumors of a split within the military. Whispers of dissent among the ranks. It was said that some soldiers were no longer willing to follow orders blindly. They questioned the leadership, the direction the country was heading, between those loyal to the Gnassingbé name and those loyal to the nation. The divide was growing, and with it, the tension. The soldiers, once a unified force, now found themselves at odds with each other, and those loyal to the nation. The tension in Lomé became unbearable. The city was a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. The people watched and waited, their fate hanging in the balance. The tension in Lomé became unbearable. The once bustling markets and streets were now filled with an uneasy silence. People moved with caution, their eyes darting around, wary of what might come next. Faure Gnassingbé, the president who had weathered so many storms, now found himself at the center of the storm. His grip on power, once seemingly unshakable, was now in question, was reportedly under house arrest. The news sent shockwaves through the nation. The president, who had ruled with an iron fist, was now confined to his residence, his future uncertain. The people could only watch and wait as the drama unfolded before their eyes. As dawn broke fully on June 2nd, the news spread like wildfire, no longer just whispers but shouts, exclamations, tears, the arrest of Faure Gnassingbé. It was real. People poured into the streets, not in protest this time, but in spontaneous celebration, in Lomé, in Sokode, in Kara, across the nation. A wave of euphoria swept through the crowds, years of pent-up frustration, years of silent suffering. It all came rushing out. They danced in the streets, strangers embraced. The news from Lomé rippled outwards, across West Africa, across the continent, and beyond. International capitals reacted with caution. Initial statements were guarded. Governments called for calm, for a peaceful transition, for the rule of law to be respected. But behind the diplomatic language, there was a keen awareness of the decades of Gnassingbé rule, of the persistent calls for democratic change. The world was watching Togo closely. The United Nations Secretary-General issued a statement, urging all parties to exercise restraint, to resolve differences through dialogue. Human rights organizations were more direct. They called for the immediate release of all political prisoners. The celebrations continued, but the morning after brought a sobering reality. The arrest of a president is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. The Togolese people stood at a crossroads. One path led backwards, to another strongman, to continued instability. The other path, more difficult, more treacherous, led towards genuine democracy, towards a nation built on justice and respect for human rights. This was the path they craved. The challenges were immense. Decades of one-family rule had hollowed out institutions, the judiciary, the electoral commission. They needed rebuilding. Trust,